This is my grandfather, Bill Targett Sr. He grew up on Victoria Road with my great-grandmother in a company house. When he came back from the war, he started at the steel plant. Around that time, the social teachings of the church were really coming to the forefront. The way my dad describes it, there was a belief that spiritual life really had to hit the ground in a meaningful way. Or the way Father Jimmy Tompkins described it, ideas had to have legs. So around 1950, the parish priest came to my grandfather and he said, if there is to be dignity in the work, there must be dignity in the worker. No more renting from the company. Get 10 families together and we'll get you a loan for a cooperative housing. So the money was only going to cover the materials, so the families that would still have to pool their knowledge resources and their labor resources in order to actually build the homes. It took several years, mostly working in the evenings after full days at the steel plant, but the 10 families moved into their new homes on Argosy Street around 1955 when my dad was 8. A few years in, one of the men got a significant promotion and found that he was suddenly able to pay off his portion of the mortgage in full. And so he wanted to buy his way out of the co-op. It fell to my grandfather as president of the co-op to convince him to stay. This was in the 60s. They had banked on the steel plant and the coal mines being there forever. They were too big to fail. Now, however, there were unpaid strikes. Not only would 9 families have to shoulder the burden of interest payments that had been divided among 10, but they would have to do so amid instability and uncertainty. 5 years later, when it was announced that the steel plant would close, as my dad puts it, hope was canceled. My grandparents no longer saw any future for their kids. My grandfather lived in that house until just a few months before he died at the age of 84, about 5 years ago, having outlived the company. It was one of the first housing cooperatives in Whitney Pier. It was an experimental model of self-reliance in an age of monolithic thinking. But my dad, of course, had been gone for 40 years at that point, having left when he was 18. So I grew up here. This is Markham, one of the mega suburbs that sprawls outward from Toronto. This is approximately the size of Cape Breton. There are 6.5 million people living here. There are another 1.5 million living in the extended area. I'm going to come back to this, but I'll defer or digress for a moment. Around March, I took part in a panel discussion with the Center for International Studies on the science, politics, and community responses to climate change. In it, I described the need for collective action in reducing greenhouse gas emissions and also the need for collective acknowledgement of the debt owed by rich nations that are responsible for the historic carbon emissions that are warming the climate, causing global warming, to the poorer nations that are the more vulnerable and will be hit first and hardest by climate change because they are in warmer climates and in lower lying regions, and also because they are the least able to adapt due to lack of infrastructure, technology, and stability. Someone at the back of the audience, who just happened to be sitting near someone that I know, leaned over to the person sitting next to him and said, if we followed these guys, they'd have us all living in caves. Now, this makes me think two things. First, why is it that when you criticize this, and I'm going to get around to criticizing this shortly, it's assumed that you only want to revert, and to this, no less, as if the pendulum can only swing between too much and not enough. I was talking about solar panels and he was only hearing caves. The second thing it makes me think is, what's so bad about caves anyways? They use active transportation, and they ate local. They heated their homes and cooked with biomass. They incorporated passive solar into the design of their homes. They recycled. Sorry for that one. They also had tons of leisure time to make art and spend with friends and family. They even had eco-adventure tourism. That's Sarah Palin. That's what happens when you Google riding a dinosaur. Okay, so back to the future, where I work as a web developer. I negotiate something called forward compatibility and extensibility, which I'm going to lump together tonight and just call future compatible. Essentially, it's the ability of a system, in this case a website, that was designed for one environment to continue to work in future environments without breaking down. Not only to continue to work, but to flourish. So you predict certain trends, and then you build into your system various design elements that will make it more resilient to change, so that it won't just break down in the future, and that will make it more adaptive to change, so that it will be able to develop and make the most of the future changing environments. So you might be able to see where I'm going with this. If we swap the offline, or the online world for the offline world, we can predict the future compatibility of another system. So let's run a couple of scenarios here. First, peak oil, where we are consuming more oil than we are able to extract from the ground. Energy prices go way up. Systems that are utterly dependent upon cheap fossil fuels are strained. People are forced to resort to providing for themselves. But of course, the knowledge resources required to do so peaked about 100 years earlier than the oil did. Prediction dire. Now another one, climate change. Droughts and flooding, extreme weather events destroy crops and croplands, and systems, food prices this time go way up, and so systems that are utterly dependent upon cheap and imported food are strained. People are forced to resort to providing for themselves and so on and so forth. And one more for good measure, a sort of perfect storm where oil peaks, energy prices go through the roof, climate change wrecks everything, and the economy collapses. But China has invested in renewable energy and has invented clean coal and is able to just come along and buy wholesale the suburbs of North America, and they turn it into a giant battery storage plant. Okay, so let's go back to the dinosaur, but not that one, this one. This is a dinosaur in two ways. First, it consumes fossil fuels, and you are what you eat. But second, it has to do with a future compatibility scenario that is more likely than the ones that I just suggested. In it, conventional oil peaks, and soon, but unconventional oil, like the tar sands, continues to grow, along with it, emissions. But various market mechanisms come into play, various incentives come into play, and long story short, energy prices fluctuate. Carbon emissions grow until maybe they don't anymore. In short, instability, uncertainty, but not necessarily the collapse of civilization. Meanwhile, people in the environmental movement may make themselves obsolete by doing a bit of monolithic thinking of our own if we reduce everything to carbon dioxide emissions, because there is an awful big picture down below. Now, I know it's easy, we get overwhelmed by that, but this is a trap because it's easy for anyone to agree that this is a problem while denying that there's anything problematic going on down below. And so the comparison I want to make between the suburbs and the dinosaurs is not what you might have thought that I was going to say, that the dinosaurs went extinct, or at least not with the fact that the dinosaurs went extinct, rather with the way in which they went extinct all at once. Because whatever happens here, and so on and so forth for the 2/3 of Canadians who live in the suburbs. The real design flaw, the design failure, in my opinion, of the suburbs is not its inability to adapt to new and changing environments, but simply the way that it ignores new and changing environments. Now, you could argue that this makes it the most successful organism on the planet if you ignored that it's at the cost of all the other organisms on the planet. It would be a perverse pseudo-sustainability, and it would be an illusion. But it's an illusion that is able to be kept up so long as everyone just goes about reproducing daily life. There's no room for creativity. And so the suburbs is boring, but as part of its design. Instead of creativity, the ethos of suburbia is self-replication. And there is increasingly nowhere left, and what's left is increasingly a sort of nowhere.